So Hannah, there should be an option for you in the toolbar to connect audio, and then once you've done that, you should be able to unmute and test your mic. All right, while Hannah's connecting, Emily, can we sound check you again?
Sure. Hi, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Perfect, loud and clear, thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Sophie.
I see you, Hannah, and I heard a bit of static, but we're not getting your voice. Do you mind testing again?
Hi guys, we're in now. Mic. Hear me now.
We can hear something, but the sound is not good. Is there a different mic you can try?
Try out my headset. Can you hear me now?
Oh, yes, perfect. That's much better. You sounded like a robot before. Now you sound like a human being. Thank you.
Excellent, because I'm mostly human these days.
Good. We'll just give people a couple more minutes and then we will get started. Great to see so many people online already. All right, so bang on 3 o'clock, and it's great to see so many of you in the room. Thank you so much for joining. Apologies to all of you for the short notice for this webinar. We will get more organised as we move forward in this series. And I am delighted to be joined today by a real star-studded cast of panellists to talk you through today's topic. So I'm going to start with a technical disclaimer, which is technology has not been on my side this week, and Zoom appears to keep crashing on me. But my colleagues Pauline and Julie are primed to step in should any technological fails happen on my end, but we keep our fingers crossed and hope for the best. Can you hear me clearly? Yes, great. Good news, thank you. If you have any problems with the sound, please just let us know in the chat box. So let's get started. Welcome all of you to the first in our mini series, which will be looking at the opportunities presented by the new and emerging operational models to deliver cash more efficiently, effectively, and accountably. So as we look forward to Cash Week in the first week of December, and we think through what the biggest developments in the world of cash and vouchers have been over the last year, the standout issue for me is the continued rise and emergence of new operational models, ways of organising ourselves differently to work together to deliver cash and vouchers. It's hugely significant, and I think we are, as a network, sort of running to catch up to understand what this means for all of us and what opportunity this presents to work better across the system. So I'm delighted to be joined by so many of you today and to welcome a truly excellent panel to give us a tour of the state of the art in understanding the outcomes and impacts of cash and how to learn from this to deliver better. So the premise of this series that we're embarking upon is that as new operational models emerge, this presents a opportunity for all of us to build on the best of what we know, to build on the state of the evidence, to deliver better, to do better with the limited resources that we have for crisis-affected people. And over the next few weeks, we're going to explore a number of key challenges and opportunities, dig into the best practice and the emerging evidence in a number of critical areas, and think through how these could be applied to some of these emerging operational models. And the key question, the reason we're starting with monitoring, evaluation and learning is that, of course, the key question as we work together differently is it working? Is it translating into better delivery? The key question for these emerging models is how do they understand what's working well and ensure that the evolution of these models and that new emerging models are being driven by delivering better? So how can we have a clearer idea of what that is, what the drivers of effectiveness are, and build upon them? So, come on, Zoom. There we go. As you have all heard me say many times before, and is not a surprise to any of you, as we deliver more cash in the humanitarian system, this implies changes to the roles of humanitarian actors and changes to the ways in which we work together. So as we've seen, the sale of cash and vouchers in humanitarian assistance has increased dramatically over the last few years, from $2 billion in 2015 up to an estimated $4.7 billion last year. And with this is coming changes to the ways that we work, changes to the roles of humanitarian actors, changes to the ways in which we work with those outside the formal humanitarian system. And it's notable that over the past several years, we've seen a number of new ways of working together to deliver cash, which we as CaLP, as the network, have bundled together under the heading of operational models. And you'll see that our definition for this is short. Our working definition of what an operational model is the overall structure through which agencies work jointly to deliver cash and voucher programming in situation response and analysis, program design and implementation. So critically, it's broader than just a delivery channel. It's working around the program cycle differently together. And we've seen, of course, a number of examples of this over the past several years. We have, just to pick out a few examples, we have the Common Cash Facility in Lebanon, the Louise model, the Common Cash Facility in Jordan, the Louise model in Lebanon, and more recently the emergence of the Collaborative Cash Delivery Network of 15 NGOs. We have Hannah representing the CCD today to talk us through their thinking here. And then most recently in December, the statement from the principals of OCHA, UNHCR, WFP and UNICEF on cash assistance, stating their intention to work together differently to deliver cash in crisis-affected contexts. So the State of the World Cash Report looked a little bit at these operational models and identified a number of different types of model, including consortia and alliances, shared cash delivery mechanisms, single agency cash delivery, and integration of systems. So we see to the right of the screen a sort of hand-picked selection of some of these, a number of different types of operational model. And these developments, we believe strongly, and in our conversations with you, we know that this is front and center in many of your minds, present a huge opportunity to build on the best of what we've learnt at the network about how to deliver more effective, efficient and accountable cash assistance, as well as presenting unique challenges in joint working and challenges in how we deliver together. We hope that through this series and culminating in the event in Cash Week, which I'll talk you through shortly, we can capture the best of what we've learned and provide recommendations and suggestions to these emerging models on how to deliver better in a way which will help us to capture that learning and deliver better across the system. So a quick word on this series before handing over to my panelists today. The aim of this mini-series leading up to our operational models event in Cash Week is to take a deep dive into some of the key issues faced by emerging models to understand three things. First of all, what does best practice in this area look like? So today, what is best practice in monitoring, evaluation and learning look like? Secondly, what does the state of the evidence, the latest evidence and research tell us about what works and therefore what we should be building on? And thirdly, what are the opportunities presented by the emergence of new delivery models and collaborative approaches to put this learning into practice and deliver better for people in crisis? So we're starting with a mini series of evidence gathering webinars, which this is the first. Today we'll look at monitoring, evaluation and learning. Next month, we'll take a deep dive into accountability to affected people, how to put recipients' voices at the centre of the response. And we're also drawing on a parallel work stream on data risk and governance to understand how emerging operational models can face those challenges. We'll survey the state of the evidence in each of these areas and understand how these new models might try to put this into practice. We'll then run a major event during Cash Week in the first week of December to pull all of this together and understand as a network, how do we make the most of the opportunities presented by emerging operational models to deliver better, and how can we learn from these models as they develop, tracking progress, capturing evidence and driving system-wide learning. So today, monitoring, evaluation and learning, perhaps the most critical question in these emerging models. So 2 years ago, and Isabel during her presentation will talk to us in more depth about this. She was the original brains behind this framework. 2 years ago, CaLP developed this analytical framework to assess the impact of and the drivers of efficiency and effectiveness in a range of different operational models. So how do we understand that? And Isabel will get into more detail on this during her presentation. And one of the key issues, the critical issue perhaps for operational models, is how to understand and act upon the impact that they're having. How do we try to understand the impact of an operational model across a response, across context and across models? How do we understand the relationship between the delivery model and the outcomes achieved? And how do we understand recipients' experience of and satisfaction with assistance received? And critically, I think the question at the heart of this is the one we opened with. How can we make sure that the development of these operational models is being driven by a real understanding about what improves outcomes for recipients, not by the deal which collaborating organizations are able to reach between them? So how do we ensure that this is absolutely oriented towards results? And it's my pleasure to introduce today our expert panel to help us understand the state of the evidence around monitoring, evaluation and learning, and about the drivers of effectiveness and efficiency in operational models. So up first we have Isabel Pelly, an independent consultant and an expert on cash and market-based programming, currently working in Haiti, specializing in linkages between cash and voucher assistance and social protection, and supporting networks to enhance their collective impact. She was, as most of you on this call know, the global program coordinator for CaLP until the end of 2018, during which time she led CaLP's work on operational models. And she's recently co-led the review of the Louise model in Lebanon. Then we'll pass to Hannah Reichart, who is the collaboration, innovation, monitoring, evaluation and learning consultant for the collaborative cash delivery network. And she's an independent consultant who was previously with Save the Children and was instrumental in the establishment of the CCD network. So it'll be really interesting to hear from her as a kind of case study. How is the CCD as an emerging operational model thinking through some of these issues? Third, we will hand over to Laura Meisner, who is an economic recovery advisor with USAID OFTA. She also co-leads the work stream on cost efficiency and effectiveness of cash and voucher assistance under the Grand Bargain, and has been a driving force behind the recently published Standard Outcome Indicators for Multi-Purpose Cash. And just before I introduce Amelie, someone is whistling, so I'm going to mute you. Good, the whistling stopped, thank you. Finally, last but not least, Amelie Sundberg is a Senior Research Officer at ALNAP. And ALNAP recently published a series of analyses on the state of evaluation overall in humanitarian action. And they're in the process of a piece of work looking specifically at the evaluation of cash and voucher assistance. So Amelie will talk us through what the big headline findings from the analysis of humanitarian evaluation is, and what this tells us about what we should be considering in emerging operational models. So a lot of talking from me. Let me hand over now to Isabel as the first of our speakers. Isabel, as the author, as the brains behind the CaLP operational models framework in the first instance, and having used this analytical framework and others to look at operational models since then, how should we be thinking about tracking the impact of these emerging models on improved delivery? What metrics should we be using? And how do we think about the different objectives, efficiency, effectiveness, and accountability, as being either mutually reinforcing or in tension with each other? I'll move through your slides for you, but please out if I'm moving too slowly. Over to you.
Thanks, Sophie. And yeah, thanks very much for that intro, and pleasure to be here with you all today. So I'm just going to share some evolving thinking, so developed by CaLP first and then also by CALP. So I've been engaged on this topic with both of those organisations, so I thought I'd reflect on how the thinking has developed. So I'm going to start with an overview of how we've been defining operational models and what we see as different delivery models for cash and voucher assistance and how they interact with these operational models. And then I'll reflect, in response to your question there, Sophie, on the challenges of measuring the value for money of these models, and in particular the need to distinguish between the value for money of cash assistance, which is something that I believe that Amelie and Laura are going to touch on, versus the value for money of the operational model itself and what that means from a measurement perspective. And in doing so, I'll therefore present a little bit on CaLP's operational models analytical framework, and then the methodology used by CALP for the DFID-funded whole of cash response study. And hopefully that will entice you to join the Cash Week event on operational models, where you'll be able to hear the findings of that DFID-funded research. And hopefully that will also set the scene for reflections on where we go from now in terms of compiling the evidence and developing common methodologies for measuring operational models, based on all the insights that myself and fellow panelists are going to share today. So moving on to the first slide on operational models. So Sophie shared a definition earlier on, and I think the simplest definition is really the overall structure through which agencies work jointly to deliver cash and voucher assistance. But actually defining that has been somewhat of a stumbling block to generating comparative evidence. And what you've got here on the slide is a framework that CALP developed and have been using for the DFID research, which is just concluding, and which we also used for the review of the Louise model in Lebanon. It's pretty simple, but just has three core components. Contractual, so how organizations work together. Programmatic layer, so that's what the collaboration delivers, so what modality, is it single or multiple projects? And then the third layer of delivery, so how is the cash and voucher assistance actually delivered? And it's as I say, it's very simple, but it's remarkably useful in terms of being able to clearly define and compare different operational models. So then going on to what we mean by different delivery models. So that's really focusing, so that's next slide, please, Sophie. That's really focusing on the third layer of this operational model framework. And this touches again on some of the different approaches that Sophie mentioned earlier on, but it's recognizing that the delivery part can be done in multiple different ways. It can be done through independent delivery, as was more the case historically, but as we know continues to be as well. It can be done through national social protection systems. And this is also a huge subject of discussion at the moment, and one which we need to intersect with this discussion on operational models and value for money. And that is in part what the DFID whole of cash response study has aimed to do. Through systems integration, so different organizations collaborating to use common systems for different parts of the program cycle, and or through segregation of functions, which is something that in particular the ECHO guidance on multi-purpose cash systems has tried to promote. So these different delivery models, they might be supported by different contractual and programmatic arrangements. And I think that's a helpful distinction. There's not one set operational model linked to each of these delivery models. And it's a key factor to remember in comparing between them, or in searching for simplistic answers to questions like, is the segregation of functions more effective? Because it will depend on what's happening in those other contractual and programmatic layers as well. So one more concept, which is that of the whole of cash response. So this concept recognizes that many different models coexist in one context. I think even in a context like, say, Lebanon, where we know there's a dominant model, there are multiple other models coexisting, and that will very likely be the reality in most contexts in which we operate. But so if different models coexist, delivering cash assistance to the same broad group of beneficiaries, then this concept of the whole of cash response can help look at overall, is cash collectively being delivered in the most efficient and effective way possible? And how do these models interact? This is particularly critical from a donor perspective in terms of making holistic funding decisions. And so this is at the core of the DFID research. So the reason that I'm sharing these concepts is because we believe that they're pretty fundamental to be able to then compare between models. And ideally, they should be ones that are sort of adopted more broadly and standardized. So now let's think about how to measure them. So the basis for measuring operational models for cash and voucher assistance is clearly the value for money framework. So I'm not going to go through this now, you'll be relieved to know, but this is just a reminder of DFID's value for money framework, which actually includes 5 elements. Earlier on we touched on efficiency, effectiveness, and accountability, but the 5 E's here are really the 5 steps of the value for money framework are quite a standardized way of looking at value for money. And particularly looking at the relationship between these different elements as well. So this framework was the basis for both CaLP's operational models analytical framework and for CAID's framework for assessing the whole of cash response models. So I just wanted to highlight that there before we then go on to discussing these 2 different frameworks. So CaLP's operational models framework. So as Sophie mentioned, this is something that we initiated at CaLP a couple of years ago, and it was developed to build an evidence base on different operational models in response to a lot of the quite political discussions that were arising with different models either being implemented in practice or being proposed in policies. And so our aim was to try and build an evidence base focused on efficiency, effectiveness, and accountability metrics, and looking at how different forms of collaboration, so if you like, different operational models, drive these metrics. And it's just a reminder that the conversation was quite nascent at that time. And so naturally, lots of things have evolved since. And so CaLP and partners conducted case studies in Nigeria, Ethiopia, Greece, British Virgin Islands, Jordan, using this framework, and those were also predated by case studies using a similar methodology in the Philippines, Afghanistan, Ukraine, and Iraq, and they're all available on the CaLP operational models thematic page. So the type of evidence, I'm not going to touch on the evidence here because we don't have the time, and that's not the purpose of this webinar, but you can have a look at those studies for more. But the type of evidence that was generated was on things like, what's the relationship between efficiency and the level of collaboration, and what costs are incurred in that process, particularly startup costs. So what kind of duration of program and scale of program warrants that, that investment in collaboration at the outset. Also, the relationship between effectiveness and collaboration, but understanding that there are a lot of contextual factors that will also influence that. So those are the sorts of, I mean, that's just a very top line, but those are the sorts of trends that came out of this. One challenge, and I feel having been quite involved, it's okay for me to say this, is that the framework didn't clearly distinguish between the value for money of the operational model itself, i.e. that whole construct of contractual, programmatic and delivery elements, versus the value for money of cash assistance. So it wasn't good enough at identifying, or it isn't good enough, but can be improved, identifying which elements actually drive those efficiency, effectiveness, or accountability gains. So there's an opportunity there, and as you'll see, the DFID framework looks at this a bit differently. There's also a real opportunity, I think, to adapt this operational framework into something that's less about evidence building, but that's more a practical tool to inform operational model design. And I think an interesting opportunity there is to explore alignment with the work of the CCD in particular. So now moving on to I'm going to call it the DFID value for money study, but it's this whole of cash response.
Isabel, I hope this is just me, but I've lost sound. Can others still hear?
The design decisions on consolidation, so consolidation of functions, consolidation of transfer, and how that influences value for money. Design-based decisions on whether or not to have a unified delivery platform, which, as we know, is something that has been talked about as being a major driver of efficiency. The segregation of functions, and then also the use of existing social safety nets. So those are the key questions that it's answering. And also how to end this research as well, compared to other comparative studies, and crucial, of course. And then what are the trade-offs that different organizations have to make between these different E's: equity, economy, efficiency, and effectiveness. And that goes to the question that Sophie asked me at the beginning, you know, what are the compromises really? So the findings of that study will be released in the next few weeks and presented and discussed in depth at Cash Week. So just to conclude, the aim of this presentation was just to give you a snapshot of different methodologies, and to try and highlight some of the overarching questions which we should be answering, and which Sophie also highlighted at the beginning. So, you know, what's more efficient and effective? Is it diverse competitors responding to harmonized specifications, or a single delivery mechanism able to provide economies of scale? In which context, under what enabling environments, and what collaboration mechanisms maximize quality, coverage, and consistency of delivery? And I'm sure all of us on this call are trying to answer these same questions, but it strikes me that we're all taking it through slightly different ends, and yet there's a huge opportunity for harmonization there. So firstly, in terms of compiling existing evidence, and using the already quite extensive evidence base to inform decision making, and then look at how can we develop shared methodologies which combine best practice on both the value for money of cash and voucher assistance and the value for money of operational models. So I'm looking forward to hearing from the rest of the panelists on how they're approaching it. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Isabel, and apologies for disappearing in the middle of that. Technology is not on my side today. We are now going to hand over to, having heard about the framework, having heard about overall how we should think about assessing the impact of operational models, let's dive down into one operational model in particular. And we're very happy to have Hannah Reichart with us today, who, as I mentioned, was around at the foundation of the Collaborative Cash Delivery Network, and has now come back as a consultant looking at monitoring, evaluation, and learning. So Hannah, could you talk us through how the CCD has been approaching this issue to date? How has the CCD been approaching the idea of monitoring, evaluation, and learning as part of the network? And what do you see as the fundamental challenges and the key opportunities in this space?
Thanks, Sophie. If you could move to next slide, that would be great. And
Sure.
so I'm just starting with a bit of background on the CCD for those. So we're very much interested in exploring what collaboration does, what it doesn't do, how you improve its outcomes, and what you need to have in place to really make it successful. Just going to wait for the presentation to come back. Next slide, please, Sophie. So in a nutshell, we promote and support easy, customizable and scalable collaboration across the cash value chain. That's what the CCD is about. And so from that statement, I'd say it's not one operational model, but moreover, the approach is through collaborative cash. And then what we see is a whole range of different kinds of operational models emerging. And what the CCD is moving towards at the moment in terms of the work it's doing to support how collaboration is designed on the ground, instead of creating a template of 3 or 4 different operational models that we ask countries to select from, we're moreover looking at the key factors and designing a tool that will enable collaborative groups to play with different factors to configure their own kind of collaboration according to their context, and effectively offline explore what's possible with different kinds of options before committing to a model and actually designing and building it. So the operational model can be an enormous range of different types. Some might be segregating different kinds of functions in the value chain. Others might explore collaborating around one particular point of tension or concern within the value chain, or it might be about collaborating geographically differently and different actors taking on roles in different areas. I feel like there's it's a broad range of different kinds of operational models, but the CCD itself is about the response being collaborative. So I hope that makes sense. Next slide, please, Sophie. I should say as well that it's formed by 15 different INGOs, and there's one NGO, Adesso, also included. It's co-led at the moment by Save the Children, CRS and World Vision, but different actors, different NGOs are taking on different roles within that initiative group. So on this slide, this is a very draft impact model or theory of change, whichever term you prefer, to explain the hypothesis behind the CCD model. So what we are building in the green box is a collection of tools to make collaboration easier, quicker, more efficient, but also more contextually led. So instead of dumping on a context a template which we think they need to fulfill, it's empowering the context and the actors within that context with the kind of tools that enable to make sensible decisions about what fits best for their context, so that they are genuinely leading their own design of configuration. And that's what the Response Builder suite of tools is all about. So the first bullet is collaboration management services, including what I've said about this design tool, plus guidance on how you support and develop collaborations, information management services to do with data sharing and data interoperability, supply chain services, looking at for instance, how you can contract in a more collaborative, efficient way with financial service providers, and also local CCD network services. So how we're looking at, within that response builder, how we can empower and support local CCDs to behave like a network of their own and be empowered to solve their own problems and create their own work plans. But of course, part of that is also about high quality evidence, because what we accept is that what I've stated to you about our hypothesis is that it needs to be tested, and we need to make sure that we're really flushing out our assumptions and genuinely committed to developing some high quality evidence that will support the learning and really improve this entire premise. So what we believe is that by providing those kind of services and by empowering CCDs locally, that we can make collaboration much easier, more customizable, etc., which will lead to more efficient responses, much less duplication, better value for money, greater scale, etc., hopefully also better coverage. with less gaps, better targeting of vulnerable people, etc. But also more effective and appropriate responses. So this is, I feel, where we probably need to be more ambitious in our language, but it's about how we make these responses more locally led and more locally owned in terms of the diversity and appropriateness of members and the connectedness to other systems like social protection systems, etc. And what we believe is that if we get all this right, of course, it will lead to better outcomes for crisis-affected people, which is what it's all about. But hopefully also it's better outcomes for the humanitarian sector in terms of context empowerment, the ability to show active innovation and adaptation, and perhaps a different way, a more ecosystem way of doing aid. Next slide, please, Sophie. Thank you. So just a couple of examples of the global projects. I mentioned to you about, in fact, what I should say is, so we have several country level platforms currently in development, which I'll talk to in the next slide. I mentioned about the collaboration design and modelling tool that's in development at the moment, and this is about finding the best way to make decisions about how you configure the local collaboration, looking at all the different options that can be in play. There's a development of a global data sharing agreement, and we're exploring active linkages at the moment with social protection mechanisms. Next slide. So this image is slightly out of date, but I didn't have time to update it, I'm afraid. But we currently have 2 functioning CCDs in Colombia and Ethiopia, and actually 4 at startup phase: Ecuador, Uganda, and also Nigeria, and I'm forgetting what the last one is, I'm afraid. Actually, I think Ecuador may have moved to functioning, so maybe that's the difference. So they're currently at different stages in very different kinds of models and look quite different, and being supported globally by the CCD, but they are setting their own local purpose and work plan and configuration according to their needs, their motivations, and what the context demands. So in terms of meal, so I've been brought on board to help the CCD to develop their meal framework and guidance for the country platforms. So we're at the nascent stages of this thinking. So I'd love to be able to answer those questions that you set at the outset, Sophie. But moreover, I can give you a direction of travel for us, which I think will be useful to explore in the coming months. So our approach at the moment is looking at these 3 areas, but this is likely to change and expand. Accountability and adaptiveness. So we're interested in exploring how we can make our meal approach privilege real-time learning and adaptation, both from program data, the community feedback, and also collaborator feedback. So how can we make real-time continuous improvement a reality in terms of how the CCD collaborations operate? What kind of tools, systems need to be in place, and cultures and behaviours to make that come to life? We also intend to support intentional innovation. So the actual CCD collaborative approach is in itself an intentional innovation, and particularly for many countries where there hasn't been a collaborative footprint in the past, they are definitely actively innovating and they feel like they are. But what we hope is through collaboration, through shared risk, through the ambition to be more transformative, collaborations, particularly as they mature, can be much more intentionally innovative about exploring different kinds of drivers for improving effectiveness and efficiency. We want to have high ambitions for evidence and modelling tools, and how we use that evidence to inform our modelling tools, I should say. So as I mentioned earlier, in that draft impact model, we need to rigorously test our assumptions. You know, we really need to prove the concept of collaboration. We make some bold claims and we totally accept that. So it's not good enough until we stand them up and really check that they're right. And what we feel is, I think, as Isabel mentioned in terms of the questions she was asking in her last slide, is that it's not a straightforward question of when does it work or not in terms of efficiency or effectiveness. But in what we know is there's a multitude of different factors at play. It may be that efficiency gains, for instance, come online more when the collaboration matures, whereas effectiveness has to be built into the design from the outset, etc. So it's a complex question, but testing these assumptions is really important. And what we want to make sure is that all the evidence we're creating, we're feeding it back into these tools, and so that we can improve the modelling selection and make sure that countries are supported with the best kind of data to help them with their decision making. But what we also know is that one of the benefits, or one of the challenges as well, of collaborative meal is it's an opportunity to harmonise and simplify M&E across a number of different operating members. So we need to agree what that looks like and make sure that we have a kind of joined up approach to make life as simple and as harmonised as possible. So we're looking at things like having a balanced scorecard, which includes different kinds of measures of success, a collaborative approach to better data. So how do we make sure that our meal approach includes a lower volume of data, but higher quality, harmonised throughout the project cycle and across the value chain? And make sure that we also take a strong collaborative approach to high quality programming standards. Next one, Sophie. So on my bullet points have gone a bit squiffy here, but these are some of the points of inquiry that we're going to be exploring, and whether that happens in terms of an internal analysis of our meal data or whether they are specific research questions that may have their own design study is yet to be defined completely. But these are the kind of questions that we
Sophia, I don't know if you're talking, but you're mute.
Hi, sorry, I got thrown out again. Hannah, did you, in the minute I was gone, did you wrap up your presentation?
Yes, I did.
Oh, thank you. I'm sorry that I missed the end of that.
It's okay.
Tech gods are not on my side today. Thank you so much. And with that, over to Laura, our next speaker. Thanks. So that was a deep dive into how CCD is looking at this, and really interesting to think through how monitoring, evaluation and learning looks from the CCD perspective. Turning now to Laura from USAID. USAID often have been closely involved in looking at how we track the outcomes of cash and how we drive greater effectiveness and efficiency in cash assistance. You in particular, Laura, have been the brains behind several of these initiatives. So turning to you, what does USAID want to see emerging operational models building in as the key principles around monitoring and evaluation? And how do you think we should be looking at tracking efficiency, effectiveness and accountability as these new models emerge and develop? And then secondly, as the co-lead of the cost efficiency and cost effectiveness workstream under the Grand Bargain, what are the findings coming out of this workstream that you think we should be applying to emerging operational models? Over to you.
Thank you, Sophie. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Excellent. Okay. Anyway, thank you for that introduction. As Sophie said, I'll be discussing what USAID has been working on, largely through the Grand Bargain, and then also in some other ways, and some of the findings and sort of where I think this all ties together and overlays with some of the work that is already going on, as Isabel said so astutely, that quite a lot of actors are moving in the same general direction. Can you go to the next slide? So just briefly, we, as Sophie said, have been co-leading the Grand Bargain Cash sub-workstream on efficiency, effectiveness, and value for money. Under that, there are a few major activities. Last year, we hosted a workshop on what my colleague Rico van der Merwe calls C2HA, or cost efficiency and cost effectiveness in humanitarian assistance. And we are specifying humanitarian assistance because it is not just cash programming that we see. A lot of the work that USAID does around comparison, particularly when it comes to food assistance, is comparing different modalities. So I think it's just important to keep that in mind. We've also co-facilitated, along with CRS and CaLP, the development of the multi-purpose cash outcome indicators as part of the Grand Bargain Cash workstream. You can find us at the link there. We released the final draft for testing earlier this year in about July, and there's already over a dozen organizations who are piloting all or part of those indicators, and I'm pleased to announce that as of earlier this month, USAID OFTA has adopted those indicators for all of our own multi-purpose cash programming as well. So we're quite excited for hopefully the large amount of data and testing that will include. USAID, in addition, along with IRC, earlier this year released the Cost Efficiency of Basic Needs Programs guidance, which you can again find at the link below. And then finally, we, along with a group of other major humanitarian donors, are part of the Donor Cash Forum, as part of which, for example, we have all openly committed to adopting the Grand Bargain multi-purpose cash outcome indicators and to further exploration of the drivers of efficiency and effectiveness. Next slide. Sophie, could you move it to the next slide, please?
Sure. Pauline, you have the reins now, so can you move to the next slide?
Sorry.
No, not you. Sorry, Pauline.
Yes, I'm trying, but it's not working.
There we go. A few things that we are noticing on the cost efficiency side. One is that for financial reporting, it's really important that people be, we'll just enjoy slightly larger slides than usual. It's really important that, to the extent possible, that we use our existing financial systems rather than trying to build a wholly separate parallel system to try and capture this data. Additionally, that to the extent possible that we are able to disaggregate by modality, and I will say openly, this is something that off-the-zone systems don't do yet, because we're set up to disaggregate by sector and not by modality. Using secondary tools such as IRC's scan tool as needed, which can pull from existing data and then do that analysis and sort of sits on top of and works with that, but doesn't create a whole parallel system. And then finally, the huge importance of contextualizing all of this with program information, right? That the location, the size of a on value for money, basing that on rigorous information, and being transparent on how we are collecting cost efficiency data and how that's being used. It looks like we're having a little bit of trouble with the slides, but I will keep going. Excuse me. On the effectiveness and cost effectiveness side, some of the things that we've noticed is that across the sector and the community, that there's really strong interest in both kinds of outcome indicators. I would be on slide 26, Pauline and Sophie, in case you're looking, so 2 further down than when you are right now. Both sort of holistic basic needs type indicators that kind of capture well-being in 1 or 2 overall indicators, as well as the more sectoral ones to capture, say, food security or access to water or shelter issues. There was also, we found and we've included, very strong interest in having not just outcomes, but a process indicator that everyone's collecting on safeguarding or protection mainstreaming, on making sure that we are not putting people at risk or doing harm or causing tension particularly when delivering cash or any other kind of basic transfer assistance. There's also, as we found with exploring the universe of possible outcome indicators, there's of course a wide range of what multi-purpose cache might do, and we really decided to keep a focus on what it is intended to do, and then again with that protection mainstreaming indicator, making sure it's not doing what it definitely should not do. So we're not capturing the full range of things, but hopefully by having a fairly circumscribed set of indicators that more and more players are all using, then we'll be able to start to have some useful data around this slightly narrower set. But that is, of course, a trade-off. One of the limitations is that nearly all of the indicators are at the household level, and they're based on household surveys. So that does limit how much we're able to drill down within the household, say between men and women, or the effect on children. And of course, it also relies on household perceptions. And so there is a bit of a challenge there if we're dealing with objective verification, say on the adequacy of shelter or on the safety and quality of water. Some of the indicators that we've included are a little bit newer and are in the process of being tested. I'm including here perhaps, say, the livelihoods coping strategies phases, which WFP is doing its own considerable rollout of. And so I think as we gather more data and there's more familiarity and usage at the field level of that, then we'll start to have useful, and excuse me, I'm getting over a cold. Then we'll start to have some useful data. And then finally, if we want to talk about cost effectiveness, then we need to have both harmonized cost measurement, as we covered in the last slide, plus harmonized outcome indicators. So that's sort of a next level ability to measure things. Because at the moment, we don't have everybody using the same cost data and ways of constructing cost indicators. And we are not yet, but we're on the path to having everybody using the same types of outcome indicators. So that's going to have to wait. Finally, if we look overall, I think some of the important things to keep in mind with the subject of this webinar is that efficiency and effectiveness are really driven by many different factors, particularly context, size, and I would say operational model is one of those. But it's really important that we are very clear about what we can caveat. I don't think that there's nearly enough data to say, oh, this operational model is the right answer here, and this other one is the right answer in this other context. Particularly because of the data to date, the analysis, the methodologies, and the ways of constructing different indicators have varied so much. So it is really important that when new findings come out that we take them for what they are, and then we analyze them in their own context and always keeping in mind their own limitations. As we are moving towards, through the grand bargain, both common metrics for measuring cost efficiency and common metrics for measuring outcomes and therefore effectiveness, I think that that is going to lead over time into making our data more comparable, which is terrific and will help us make more evidence-based decisions. When I say us, I mean the sector as a whole. But I don't think that we're quite there yet. I do also think it's important to note that there can often be trade-offs between cost efficiency and cost effectiveness. It may be, for example, that adding complementary services will improve effectiveness and therefore cost effectiveness, but will, say, reduce cost efficiency because we are not reaching as many straight outputs if we're adding costs in there. So I think that that's really clear. And finally, I don't think that we need to let a lack of perfect data at this point in time keep us from making decisions as best as we can with the evidence that we have to hand. And of course, realizing that particularly around operational models, that decisions have to be driven by context and by what's feasible with the players there. I would hope that the growth in new operational models that highlight more collaboration and more harmonization give us a terrific opportunity to collect quite a lot of this data at scale. For example, I was just in Colombia where CCD is doing cash programming with USAID and other support. And I'm quite excited because several of the grand bargain multi-purpose cash outcome indicators are going to be tested at scale across a wide number of partners. So I think opportunities like this for us to generate this data where everybody is collecting it in the same way, and the context is remaining fairly comparable across those data points, is an exciting way for us to try and move forward. That is all I have. Thank you so much, Sophie.
Thank you so much, Laura. And again, masterful muddling through in the absence of the right slide in front of you. Thank you so much. Really useful food for thought there. Zooming all the way out now from a specific focus on the multipurpose cache outcome indicators and the standard metrics that are beginning to emerge, to an overall look from ALNAP at evaluation across the humanitarian system. Over to you, Amelie. So what does your recent research, what does ALNAP's recent research on humanitarian evaluation tell us about what in general we're getting right and where we're falling short? And as new collaborative models around cache emerge and develop, what would you recommend based on this learning that they bear in mind around evaluation and learning? Over to you.
Great, thanks so much, Sophie, for the introduction. Hi everyone, pleasure to be here. Just keeping an eye on the time, I do want to make sure that there's time for questions for everyone at the end. So I'll try and get through this quite quickly and just do the highlighted parts. So as Sophie mentioned, ALNAP has been doing a series of work on monitoring and evaluation at the broader level of the humanitarian system. And one of these projects was looking specifically at how outcomes are being measured. And we thought it would be quite useful to think about, okay, what are the implications that this has for cache-based assistance and the different models coming out around cache-based assistance. And we will, in the near future, also be doing a piece of work on then what does that mean for evaluation of cache. So today, I just wanted to give my high-level thoughts on the key takeaways from the research that we did. You're very welcome to go read the report in full. And you know, if I were to sort of encourage CCD or any of these other initiatives, sort of things to think about in their M&E frameworks, what those might be. So if we could go to the next slide, that would be great. So, okay, wonderful. So the purpose of the paper that we did looking at outcomes monitoring was to identify the core assumptions and foundational thinking behind current monitoring systems. So as humanitarian practitioners, what are some of our embedded assumptions, biases, sort of cognitive processes around what we perceive outcomes to be? And then we looked at, okay, how are these actually being measured at the moment? And as won't be a surprise to any of you on the call, you know, it's very organizational agency based, if not just project based, which means that there's a multitude of different models out there. So we wanted to map what these different models are and try and figure out to what extent different ones seem to be working vis-a-vis others. So from that, we were able to identify key issues arising from current practice around outcomes monitoring, and really wanting to push the boat out a little bit in raising questions to think about this differently and challenging conventional thinking. And I think that's why it's really exciting today when we're talking about new collaborative models, because it is an opportunity to think about doing things differently from how we have done before. So if we go forward to the next slide, the first thing I'd like to talk about is just what are organizations doing. So when we talk about monitoring and evaluation systems, I mean, system is a word that gets bandied about, but it means lots of different things to lots of different organizations depending on their objectives and the resources they have available to them. So one of the things that's done is articulating global level outcomes. So the type of objective setting or indicators that Laura was just talking through. Then organizations set policies on M&E and reporting frameworks. Sometimes these are completely decentralized, but it's general guidance and advice for how country officers should be doing their M&E. Then there's technical advice for M&E staff on how to measure an outcome. And then the more recent trendy thing is developing data management systems that can try to centralize the collection of all of this data. So that's what organizations are doing, and it's quite important to note that only a few organizations are doing all these different things. Some organizations are doing none across the whole global sort of humanitarian spectrum. So it's very difficult to figure out what combination and how the combination comes together to make best practice. But what we have seen is that those organizations who seem to be doing this better, and when I say doing this better, I mean actually collecting data on outcomes that appears to be verifiable, and the analysis is nuanced enough to actually contextualize the information that's coming in to inform programming. So just trying to pin down what success looks like is key to think about the different audiences and what the data is used for. But what we saw with organizations who are managing to do this, or starting to manage to do this, is that they're spending a lot of money on it. There's a huge investment in order to make this work at an organizational level. So we're talking about at least up to 6 years of work, from conceptualization phase, sort of internal political lobbying, design, getting ownership and buy-in across the board at HQ and country level, to then actually testing something, rolling it out and improving it. In part due to project cycle lengths and yearly reviews, but just to flag that this stuff is not easy, and it takes a lot of time and a lot of money and a lot of staff to get it done. And I think therefore it's really important, speaking to the point in the previous presentations around trying to keep things as simple and as necessary as possible. So then in terms of looking at, okay, so despite all these efforts, organizations are still struggling. So what are they struggling with? And if we could go to the next slide, I could just highlight that there's such a wide variation in organizations in the amount of the work done. But what's really interesting is few organizations know what other organizations have tried. So when we're looking at collaborative models for cash, I think the starting point is to think about within a collaborative environment at the country level or at the global level, whatever it might be, between UN agencies or between individual NGOs, it will be really important for organizations to share with each other what they're actually doing at the moment in terms of measuring outcomes, because during our research, everyone was really curious. You know, you speak to Oxfam, they want to know what NRC are doing, NRC want to know what DRC is doing, but the lessons learned around how to measure outcomes aren't even necessarily being shared. And we're not talking about indicators here, but we're talking about actual sort of day-to-day measurement and getting the job done. So then moving to the next slide. Great. So the key finding that we had, and the key challenge for monitoring of cash as well, is the fact that most organizations have built monitoring systems layer by layer by layer by layer by layer, depending on requirements they've had. And so what specifically as well, when we're looking at multi-sectoral cash, this is sort of the latest requirement, the type of outcomes that an organization wants to measure. So they've just been layered on top of the same system, which is overstretching the system because they're trying to achieve different goals, whether that's sectoral or audience or metrics or whatever it is, trying to achieve different goals all within the same system. So although we don't want to, given the state that we're in now, we're not necessarily promoting the idea that everyone needs to come up with all these parallel systems, but I do think we need to fundamentally rethink our current systems and not just keep layering on top and top. So if we then go to the next slide, that's just a chart on explaining the different data needs for different audiences, but I don't want to go into it too much now because of the time. So, but you're welcome to look into that in more detail later on. So then if we could go to the next slide again. Great. So the key findings and the implications for what this means for cash-based systems. So what we found in terms of how these M&E models are built, there are 4 sort of key things. So first is that sectoral silos persist. So even when we have multi-sectoral cash, many agencies are still defining additional separate outcome indicators for sectors because this is what slots into the existing data management system that they have. Also, the terminology that's being used is still very similar to the way that we're approaching sector-specific outcomes. So we're not actually reconceptualizing it as multi-sector. We're kind of taking what we already know across different sectors and squeezing it into what we're considering to be a multi-sector. Then there's the temptation of standardization. So although harmonization is great, but there's questions around, in some senses, in order to try and aggregate data. But as was raised in a previous presentation, we won't necessarily be able to get global level outcomes anyway, because we need to contextualize everything we have. So there are questions around how can you harmonize without standardizing, because standardizing can become a bit of a straitjacket, particularly when often in reality there's not enough time to formulate specific outcomes for each project each time. So standardized outcomes get cut and pasted, and particularly in a protracted crisis, this becomes a bit dangerous because you're immediately cutting yourself off to looking at unintended outcomes or the true real outcomes that you're supposed to be seeing. Then that brings me to this sort of limited open-ended inquiry issue. So many agencies are chasing quantitative indicators based on pre-identified expected outcomes. And I thought it was very interesting, Laura's point about, at some point you're going to have to choose what to prioritize. And so there's often this prioritization of, okay, well, what do we want the cache to be able to do? And that's what we're going to try and measure. But there may be beneficial outcomes to the cache that we didn't know. So there's this, I think, this sort of assumption around that when we're looking at unintended outcomes, we're only looking for negative outcomes. That's not necessarily the case. And it's also not necessarily about just what we're looking for, but it's about the methodology of getting there. There's an over-reliance on quantitative methods that inherently aren't able to contextualize to the extent that we want to. So that's where qualitative methods become really important, and the focus on indicator measurement doesn't open up the space for more qualitative measurements of outcomes. Then the final thing that I wanted to talk about was data management. So modeling of data management is extremely project-based still, and doesn't have a lot of space for more qualitative open-ended inquiry. And when we're thinking about multi-purpose cache, that doesn't necessarily actually fit into project-based data management systems. So we end up trying to squeeze in what we want to know about cache within the data format that we would typically use for sectoral projects. And that's a bit limiting when we're talking about cache at scale. So those are organizational challenges that I think would be pertinent for any cache-based assistant, but also at a collaborative level. So if we go to the next slides, that's just a summary of what I was talking about, but I think it begs the question of, well, even organizations are trying to do too much with one system. So how are networked collaborative systems actually going to bring everything together? I think that's going to be a huge challenge. So if we go to the final slide, great. I think there are a few things that networks could be or should be thinking about when developing these frameworks, is actually breaking down the intention in the audience. So when you talk about an M&E framework for CCD, for example, who is actually going to be using the different types of data and what for? And then you might actually need to break down your different data points and your different models depending on your audience, rather than trying to create one holistic system. And trying to think about this differently, so breaking the mold. And we spoke about maximizing opportunity to address the shortcomings of existing systems. So recognizing, okay, partners in our collaborative network, they already do this, but what do they not do? So rather than focusing on data sharing and harmonization standardization, is there actually like a gap filling role that these networks can fill and contribute to the overall understanding of the results of cache? And there you could also think about, okay, can we rethink measurement points? So we've talked about the effectiveness of aid modeling in cache at scale, but ensuring that you actually maintain a self-evaluative space, because inherently it's an existential question. If you're finding evidence that's saying that actually maybe this collaborative model isn't really working, how are you going to tackle that data, and what does that mean for you? So those are just sharing my thoughts and the results of the paper. And you can see more of our work at our website, which is on the final slide. And that's from me. It's 3:07. So if anyone wants to have a more in-depth conversation with me at any point, please do feel free to get in touch. But for now, I'm just going to sign off.
Thank you so much, Emily. And what a brilliant place to leave us and open up to the questions with some thoughts around these emerging operational models giving us an opportunity, a blank slate opportunity to build intentionally and differently, to maintain a self-evaluative space. How do we handle situations where the data is telling us things that we don't want to hear? And how do we build in more genuine adaptiveness? Thank you. Real food for thought. And with that, I think I'm going to hand it over to everyone else on the call to see if there are any questions. We were speaking just before the call to colleagues from WFP, who are on the call. I wonder if you have any reflections just to get us started on what you've heard. Nesreen, I don't see on the call, but to hear, yes, anything you'd like to reflect on that you've heard in the last hour?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. So thank you so much to all of the presenters. This has been very, very interesting, and in many ways, this has sort of let's say rang a bell with me and with the common cash statement that was issued late last year by WFP, UNHCR, UNICEF, and OCHA. And I was particularly happy to hear from Isabel that in fact these operating models are can coexist in the same context, and it sort of affirms what we've been sort of finding is that these types of collaborative models are by their very nature going to be different based on the different contexts, the different partnerships that might be forged at the country office level and a humanitarian response. And so, in fact, these are things that we're going to sort of do on a case-by-case basis, and it's very much what we've been sort of telling, sort of collectively, the three agencies and OCHA telling our country offices is that this is not a top-down approach or sort of a model that's sort of set in stone. This is something that really has to be sort of organically grown, and with the understanding that collaboration is something that we're all striving for, and that we're all hoping that through this collaborative effort we are going to be gaining cost efficiencies and effectiveness. Now, I say those words, and I'm very grateful to our colleague from ALNAP who just also outlined some of the challenges in trying to measure some of these things. We are sort of little bit not exactly at the baby stage, but at the toddler stage of this collaborative effort that we forged with the three agencies, and which, of course, like I said, is at the country office level, is open to all of the operational agencies that bring value and can see value in collaborating amongst each other. So we're a little bit early in being able to say, you know, what have we actually achieved through this collaborative effort? Has there been sort of cost efficiency gains, effectiveness? Absolutely way too early to say anything about that. And certainly I think the colleague from ALNAP just outlined how some of these things need to be, and it's been very useful for me particularly to use those pointers in terms of how we move forward in terms of measuring measuring outcomes. So one great thank you for all of that, and like I said, the part of what we've been doing collaboratively with the various partners at the ground level are, like I said, organically growing, and they range from, in the 6 case study countries which we have identified there. If you look at the action plans of each of those country offices, they're quite they vary to quite a I'm lost for it, vary a lot. But there are some things that we're also doing, let's say at a corporate level, things like let's get better at jointly and collaboratively working on procuring the services required for the delivery of cash. So that requires a certain amount of system harmonization and sort of just aligning our various processes so that we are confident in each other's procurement processes. And the other one is about, in fact, data sharing. And if we are going to be collaborating, and part of that will require some sort of data sharing. And so we're looking at seeing how we can, very mindful of the need to protect data, but how can we share data amongst the agencies that will hopefully mean that we're able to deliver better services and better support to humanitarian people affected by humanitarian disasters. So really just a few words, and thank you very much again to the panelists. Very useful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tahir, and thank you for extemporizing and joining at the last moment. That's greatly appreciated. Just to make sure that I've understood this issue that's come up from several of the panelists about balancing the need for contextual specificity versus the need for common metrics, so we can kind of establish a database by which we can compare different models in different places. Where have the UN agencies come down on that? Are there standard outcome indicators across contexts, or will those be defined at the country level?
No, so at the operational level, this is going to be defined at the operational level. So each of the country offices will be looking at their, trying to look at what kind of better outcomes we're achieving through this collaboration. But that's, like I said, I mean, we're still a little bit in the, what does this collaboration mean? Which areas can we collaborate on? And so we're a little bit too early for us to say anything definitive or even vaguely remotely close to reality is on that particular issue. So we're still in the learning phase. This is going to be, and obviously we have 6 pilot or 6 case country studies, but the idea is that from these case studies we can begin to look at things that are emerging from those efforts at those country office levels. We will then obviously we'll move this to other country offices and other contexts, slightly informed, but I think also again more grounds for us to be learning from, because again they could be quite different from even the 6 that we've chosen or that we sort of selected. Over.
Great, thank you very much for shedding some light on that. Fantastic. So if others have questions for any of the panelists or any thoughts that they want to share on this issue, we have 15 left. If you're able to raise your hand, which means right-clicking on your name on the list of participants, I should be able to see you in the queue and bring you in. Yes, so if you right-click, if you're able to raise your hand. If you're unable to master that technology, which happens to me a lot, do just drop a note in the chat box and I can bring you in. Over to all of you. I can hear ominous rumblings, but I don't see any hands. Any questions at all for our panelists, or have you been stunned by their perfect presentations into silence? No further questions. Wow, I think this is a first. All right, well, well done, panelists, and Tahir for stunning everyone on this call into silence. I'll attempt to kind of pull out a couple of common threads that we've seen here, and we will then scribble up some of the kind of key takeaways from this call and have them inform Kashweek. Oh, I see someone in the chat that's trying to come in. Great, so a question in the chat. Joe, feel free to, a great question, feel free to unmute your mic and ask that out loud if you're able to do so.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I came very late to this webinar, and what a great webinar it was, thank you. But yes, is the World Bank engaged in this discussion in terms of the selection of the indicators? Somebody mentioned that the indicators are often sort of household level based, and so yeah, so just wondering where the World Bank is. Are they engaged, and are they offering indicators that might be of use and bring in the sort of nexus elements?
Great question. Laura, can we ping that to you?
Sure. Hi, Joe, and thanks for your question. Because the indicators were done under the Grand Bargain auspices, it was open to anyone who wanted to participate who was part of the Grand Bargain community. The World Bank was not part of those efforts, although certainly going forward, if they're interested in engaging, I think we would be interested in engaging.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. And I think in general, as we look at in particular what the outcomes of multi-purpose cash are, there's sort of a bit of a quest which started in Laura's work stream and which has been continued now by the British Red Cross and ICRC to look at kind of what a more holistic well-being indicators look like. And in that we can try to borrow from the development side of the house and try to engage with the World Bank more. I think as with almost every topic in humanitarian cash and vouchers, there is a lot more that can be done on linking up with our colleagues on the development side and understanding how the bank tracks some of this stuff, while bearing in mind, of course, that as we focus on areas of humanitarian need and alleviating humanitarian need, that there may be slightly different objectives in our programming, but an area for sure that we can learn from. Thank you. Great question. Any other hands or thoughts at this point? Right, well, if not, then it looks like we will be wrapping up on time. So I'll just try to pull out a couple of the key takeaways for me. And as I re-listen to the recording, there may be other bits that jump out. You may have picked up on other bits and pieces, but I think for me, there's sort of 6 key points that have come out of these excellent presentations. And thank you so much to our panelists for sharing all of this. I mean, I think the starting point of this webinar series was the you know, as Tahir and Hannah mentioned, there are some big emerging collaborative approaches that are kind of early in their journey of working out how this all works and working out how this looks in different contexts. And this really provides an opportunity to build on to build systems and approaches in these models that are intentional and build them in from the outset. So all that we've learned from the kind of piecemeal approaches to monitoring, evaluation and learning across the humanitarian system and across cash actors, we can try to distill into building better in these systems. And that, I think, is a very hopeful message. The second bit that came out of all of the presentations, I think, is monitoring and evaluation are all well and good, but the real value add comes where you build in adaptiveness. So how do we focus on the kind of end point of the cycle and learn to build models and build approaches which are very adaptive and which can take bad news in their stride? So how are we gathering data about what's effective and what's having an impact, and using this not just as a sort of PR exercise to say we've done what we said on the tin, but really very sincerely taking this on board, learning from it and adapting based on that learning. And to the extent possible, sharing that across the system. So this learning is a common good and it helps us all to deliver better. Some great points from several of the panelists on the fact that it would be naive to think that efficiency, effectiveness and accountability are kind of mutually reinforcing, and that in different models, in different places, we are going to see trade-offs between them, and that what you gain in efficiency may come with losses in accountability. And so as a network, we need to understand what our priorities are. Is it better to deliver, in some contexts, a highly efficient cash program that reaches the maximum number of people, but that doesn't meet sphere standards, that doesn't represent a quality response? Or do we place such a value on accountability and equity that actually we're prepared to make that trade-off in the other direction? I think a sort of emerging tension between the importance of common metrics, the need for common metrics so that we can build a database so that we can learn collectively, but at the same time not over standardizing everything and realizing that context is everything. And I think this came out from every single speaker, that we can't sit in a chair in Geneva and work out based on the evidence we have an operational model that works everywhere and for everyone. This is going to be highly context specific, and we're going to look at different models in the same place, picking up different parts of the system, and it's going to be far messier than would be suggested by the idea that we can simply measure common metrics and leave it there. I think I really liked Hannah's point about the fact that it's very easy to make a lot of claims about what new operational models are for and what they're delivering, and we have to be very honest and robust about the way that we test those claims. And I really appreciated, Hannah, you saying that that's going to be a very transparent and public process, and I think we look forward to following that journey and supporting it wherever possible. And then the key thing that again came out of every presentation is the need to not only learn these lessons, but share lessons, share approaches to measuring outcomes. This is an incredibly complex territory, and the extent to which we can do a better job of sharing learning will be a huge help. So we look forward to picking up on some of those issues in the Cash Week event. I see, Raymond, you had a question or a point on coordinated approaches. Do you want to unmute yourself and add that point now before we close?
Okay, hello, this is Nesrine actually. I'm sorry, we signed in from Raymond's computer.
Ah, I'm sorry about that, please.
No problem. Yes, so sorry for jumping in very late. I also just wanted to actually just maybe comment, but you also wrapped up quite well. I think all of the points that were discussed are very valid. Just also to, again, just emphasize how every context is very different, and that systems, if established in common frameworks, would have to be flexible enough to be adapted to individual contexts. But I also think that across UN agencies, there is already a lot of effort in coordinating very well, also in terms of monitoring to make sure that common frameworks are established, and then in agencies are actually contributing individually or in joint efforts through joint assessments, through maybe joint data collection, but also in actually sharing reports, assessment results, studies within interagency or cross-sectional forums. So yeah, I just wanted to contribute this part, that this is something that's undergoing while there is maybe not a common global standardized system as such, or maybe it's very difficult to pinpoint standard indicators so far. But I guess also the whole multi-purpose cache, shift to multi-purpose cache, for example, has also resulted in more work and being done in identifying, again, appropriate and useful indicators to measure efficiency across the board. So I think it's a work in progress, and yeah, common points like Tahir was saying, data sharing are very important, and then harmonization of systems, but also remaining flexible enough for adaptation.
Brilliant, thank you. And that's such an important point. Thank you for raising it, Nesrine, that this is, there is so much learning and so much progress out there to build on. And I think you're right that the sort of growth of multi-purpose cache has pushed us to look at outcomes in a different way, and to take a more holistic approach to monitoring and evaluation that we should build on. So if there are no other comments or questions, I'm going to close there and say a huge thank you to our panelists for their brilliant presentations. I haven't checked with them yet whether they're happy for me to circulate the presentation, and I'll do that after this call and get back to you. But the webinar recording will be available. We'll do a short note with some of the key takeaways, and we look forward to picking all of this up during Cash Week. And yeah, picking this up during Cash Week. And for those of you who can't be in London, we will be webcasting the panel, so you'll be able to see where we get to on some of that. Thanks so much to all of you for taking the time, and to our brilliant panelists. And we will see you in a couple of weeks, I hope, for the same deep dive into accountability to affected populations. Thanks so much to all of you. Bye.
Bye-bye.